All right, so we're on to episode 19 of the Narthex now. I think that's pretty amazing. But picking up from where we left off last week, we were talking about conversion stories, and King David was our topic of conversation last week. And his issue was that he was so delusional that he was committing sin out of just total delusion. And how do we break through to people like that? And we mentioned halfway through talking about dramatic conversion stories, such as Paul's conversion story. So I thought maybe we could start this episode off talking about him. I know that we love talking about Paul. We're talking about him a lot in church right now. But he was somebody who is committing like religious sin or sin because of his total delusion out of his devotion um, to religion.
Yeah, I keep coming back to that parable of the prodigal son where Jesus tells it in Luke 15, where you have two sons. And the key to the parable is to understand that there's what we typically label the prodigal son goes into the far country and spends his father's inheritance on what's called loose living, which we know is like partying and prostitutes. The parable even says that. And you have an older son who stays home and he's obedient to his father and he does whatever his father says and he's morally just obedient. The point of the parable is that both of them are lost. One is lost because of his obvious sin and disobedience to the father, which is your younger son, your prodigal son. And then you have the older one who's lost not because of his disobedience, but through his obedience. And that's the little aspect that I think Christians usually miss, or people usually miss, is that in many ways we're farther from God because of our moral obedience, and we think that God owes us, and we followed his commands. And you have a disobedient and an obedient son. The parable should be called the parable of the two lost sons, because they're both lost. One's lost in his religiosity, thinking that gives him salvation. One's lost in his disobedience or irreligiosity, thinking that if he could just go be himself and live the life that he feels that he wants to live deep down, he could find fulfillment, contentment, satisfaction, and righteousness. Both are lost. And it's usually that obedient one that we typically think is one that he looks good externally. The younger son looks brutal externally, but internally both are lost. And so you have David in the Old Testament, who's everyone would read that would say, that's obvious sin. You know, you're sleeping with your best friend's wife and murdering your best friend. It's like, that's obvious. You get to Paul in the New Testament, Saul of Tarsus, and it's a little less obvious because he's very upright, very ethically oriented. And he says in Philippians 3, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee of Pharisees, and he is just doing everything perfect and proper. And he, in many ways, is as lost as David is in his murderous adultery. We talked about last week that most people don't convert some do, in super emotional, dramatic ways like that. So it was dramatic. But if all we had was Acts 9 and Acts chapter 22, we would say it's dramatic, but we'd also say that it looks like it was real sudden.
Yeah.
Like bang, it just happened. Like the light from heaven, he converts. It's dramatic. It was sudden. But with that chapter 26 where Jesus says, Paul, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It's hard to kick against the goads. Jesus is saying, in essence, there to Paul, like, you've been kicking me for a while here, and it hurts, doesn't it, Paul? It doesn't feel good, does it? I mean, life is the anger, the rage, the anxiety, the depression. You're kicking me. I'm correcting you. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to get you off a dangerous course, and you're kicking back at me, and it hurts. So that tells us that Paul's conversion was dramatic, but not necessarily sudden, because he's been kicking against the goads. Jesus implies, well, it doesn't imply it. He explicitly says this, you've been doing this for a while.
Right.